This is what we call 6 ways to die. And basically, your 6 ways to die are you're too hot, you're too cold, you have hunger, you have thirst, you have illness, and you have injury. And fundamentally, if you don't die of one of those causes, you're not going to be dying of any. Hot and cold, we typically manage with clothing and shelter and a few other things along those lines. Hunger and thirst, we have supply chains that bring us water and food. And for illness and injury, fundamentally what we have is hospitals and security services. So this is kind of shelter, this is supply, this is safety. This sort of tripod of shelter, supply and safety is basically the system which collapses in disasters. So shelter is typically hard physical assets. I mean, to some extent it's things like clothes, but fundamentally what stops us dying from heat and cold most of the time is hard, what do they call it, physical plant, right? It's built up physical infrastructure. Supply, on the other hand, is processes. So supply is this continual process that generates clean water. It's this continual process that generates food around you. And those are continuous, ongoing, running transactions. It's kind of metabolism. And this is, of course, the tricky thing to maintain in disasters, right? Something terrible happens, and it's not the first 3 weeks that you have the problem. Well, I mean, okay, it's the first 3 weeks you have an immediate problem. But then, when everybody leaves and the cameras have gone somewhere else, then the supply process runs out and people are left just screwed again. And then safety is typically human services oriented, right? By and large, our resistance to illness and our resistance to injury come from things like hospitals and doctors. And there are protective infrastructures, right? Things like a clean water supply will protect you from all kinds of illness. But if something goes wrong, it's fundamentally hospitals, doctors, police, armies, and so on that come in and deal with your problem. So this thing of physical plant, supply chains, or supply metabolism, and support staff is how we manage to stay alive in the developed world. We've got very, very good systems in each of these areas, and as a result, everything pretty much works. So the second part of this is that you have concentric rings of supply. So, for example, if you think about food, right? If you think of this ring as being household, and then out here you've got town, and then out here you've got region, and then out here you've got country, and then out here you have the world. So the further you go from the individual, the further you go out, kind of not just in distance, but also across jurisdiction and space. If you're a Westerner, typically you have very little food storage at home. Usually, maybe 2 or 3 days worth of food storage. Then at a town level, you have stores, which have maybe a week's worth of food storage and some warehousing. And then there's a trucking fleet which moves things backwards and forwards from the global food markets, which in this case happen to be the port down the way. Right. So what you have is this notion that your infrastructure is, you've got a little bit here, you've got a whole bunch of stuff at the town level, and then you've got most of the actual food, heavy lifting, is done by these global markets and this global distribution network. On the other hand, if you're one of these backyard farmers, of which we've got maybe 3 billion on the planet, almost your entire food process is what grows in your backyard. Your little 1-acre farm that you inherit from your great-grandparents. What that means is that disruptions out here affect you less if your infrastructure is very close to yourself, very close to your centre. And particularly in things like wars, the primary infrastructure disruptions are all at the national level. In disasters, the primary infrastructure disruptions are at the local level. And this again is one of these critical distinctions between kind of the old school Red Cross model and the war as the prototype of disaster model versus the poverty as the prototype of disaster model, right? This is really the fundamental hinge of the situation, is that the organisations which have war as the prototype of disaster have a completely different mindset from the organisations which have poverty as the prototype of disaster. And poverty is the prototype of disaster, right? 30-something million people a year die of causes related to poverty. The number for war hasn't been that high since the middle of the Second World War, if it ever reached that number. It's a whole different situation. Actually, I'm pretty sure it didn't. I think the total death toll for the Second World War was about 25 million soldiers and so on. Not counting death camps. So this model of looking at the individual and then looking at where is the infrastructure which prevents these things happening to them allows you to build up a very quick map of fundamentally what is keeping people alive, and secondly, where are their gaps. So this is an infrastructure mapping tool.